Alright, so hello everyone. I will be presenting my assignment for the short story Araby for psychoanalytic criticism. So basically, I'll be talking to you guys about the psychoanalytic criticism for Araby and how psychology started and how it's improved our world today and continues to do so. To start with, we have the summary of what psychoanalytic criticism is. When talking about psychology, we often refer to the brain. We don't always realize that the brain is a very interesting yet complex body part to understand. Throughout the short story Araby, getting to know the main character, the narrator, I noticed that when he thinks of something, he thinks of it in a very intellectual and unusual way. Most boys in their youth do not always think of girls as gracefully as he does, at the same time repeatedly thinking of her the way he does. When the narrator introduces Mangan's sister, he describes his feelings with overexcitement and racing thoughts. Although that seems normal to have, he may not be like other boys. He had grown up in a strict Christian home. Psychologists have told that children in their youth tend to be more interested in the opposite gender when restricted to do so. In the narrator's case, he was definitely into Mangan's sister, but also looking deeper into his interesting personality, I found that he has OCD, obsessive compulsory disorder. This is when the human mind cannot help but continuously think of one thing over and over again. It's not the same for everyone. Some get obsessive thoughts over anything, for example, washing hands multiple times, having to know where their partner is at all times, having to wear a certain color all the time, and in the narrator's case, thinking about Mangan's sister a little too often. When the narrator is speaking to Mangan's sister, he also gets nervous, which is very common, especially amongst those who don't interact with the opposite gender too often. But I would still like to say that he has a minor anxiety disorder. This is also shown a few times throughout the story. One was when his elderly uncle was making him late to go to the bazaar. This was described as him wanting to not be disrespectful but still got his nerves working to make him slightly impatient and tense. Another time would be when he lost track of time with the thought of Megan's sister. He was late to go and check out any stalls to find the perfect gift for her. He got anxiety and was reluctant to asking anyone for help, but eventually did so. With a bit of courage, he asked a British lady at a stall, but she ended up not being very helpful. Realizing it was too late, the narrator was filled with some anxiety and was helplessly gazing at the sky and ended up leaving without a gift for Megan's sister. Moving on to slide 3. Psychology of the brain from then to now. OCD, depression, anxiety, bipolar, narcissistic, PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, and many more are different types of mental health illnesses people are being educated about in 2017. Ever wondered how it all started? How these disorders were even discovered? Or who was it to start psychology and make it such an interesting fact of life involving human interaction, human development, and of course, the growth and functioning of the human brain itself? Wilhelm Wundt was the first to open an institute for experimental psychology at the University of Leipzig in Germany in 1879. This was to be the first laboratory dedicated to psychology, and its opening is thought of as the beginning of modern psychology. Mr. Wundt is often referred to as the father of psychology. Mr. Wundt was an important man because he was the first to differentiate psychology from philosophy by analyzing the workings of the mind in a more structured way. Of course, with the emphasis of being on objective measurement and control, Mr. Wundt's background was in physiology, and this was reflected in the topics with which the Institute was concerned about. He studied the reaction times in sensory processes and attention. For example, participants would be exposed to a standard stimulus, for example, a light or the sound of a metronome, and asked to report their sensations. His main goal was to record thoughts and sensations and to analyze them into their constituent elements, the same way a chemist would analyze chemical compounds in order to get the underlying structure. During his academic career, Mr. Wanda trained 186 graduate students, 116 being in psychology. This was very significant and helped disseminate his work. In fact, a student named Edward Titchener, who described his system as structuralism, or the analysis of the basic elements that constitute the mind. Mr. Wanda wanted to study the structure of the human mind using the introspection method. In other words, observation. He strongly believed in reductionism, making difficult things in a simpler form. That is, he believed consciousness can be broken down or reduced to its basic elements. Moving on to slide number 4. Of course, we've all been waiting for this one. What is a psychoanalytic criticism without Sigmund Freud? I'm sure we've all heard of the famous Sigmund Freud. He has many different theories explaining why humans, mainly teens, think the way they do. His psychoanalytic theory of personality argues that human behavior is the result of the interactions among 3 component parts of the mind: the id, the ego, and the superego. This is what he likes to call a structural theory. This is when personality places a great importance on how conflicts around the mind are made to shape behaviors and personality. Ever gotten really impulsive to do something and not think of the consequences? Sounds like a majority of the youths and some adults. According to Freud, these conflicts and rush decision-making we do is often unconscious. So, I guess you have a good excuse to tell your parents. From childhood to now, our personality develops and is critically shaped through a series of 5 psychosexual stages, which is called the psychosexual theory of development. Freud's ideas had been met with criticism, in part because of his singular focus on sexuality as the main driver of human personality development. Coming back to psychoanalytic theory of personality, Freud argues that human behavior is the result of the interactions among 3 components of the mind. Again, the id, ego, and superego. This is known as his structural theory of personality, which places a great emphasis on the role of unconscious psychological conflicts in shaping behavior and personality. Dynamic interactions can often be thought as the fundamental parts of the mind, which are thought to process through 5 distinct psychosexual stages of development. Freud's structure on the human mind state that our personality develops from the interactions among what he proposed as the 3 fundamental structures of the human mind. Conflicts with these 3 structures, keep in mind, id, ego, and superego, and our efforts to find a new balance among what each of them desires will determine how we behave and approach the world. So I'm pretty sure we've all been in a situation where we know something is wrong, but we still sometimes go for it and do it, and that's very common among youths. But sometimes if we follow this following example, we'd be able to get through it and maybe not make as many of these mistakes further on in life. So for example, the id would be, I want to do that now. The superego would be, it's not right to do that. And the ego would be, maybe we can compromise. This is the conflict within the mind. According to Freud, the job of the ego is to balance the aggressive/pleasure-seeking drives of the id with the moral control of the ego. Sounds like a lot of us in high school or who were in high school. Not a problem. Pretty sure we're all over that now. And my second favorite, the psychoanalytic criticism of Araby. I really enjoyed making this slide because I got to actually almost pretend to be a psychologist and actually diagnose the main character in what he is and who he is. So when discussing the main character, the narrator coming across a lot of his character traits, noticing his actions being described throughout the story, it greatly connects with Freud's psychosexual theory as well as his psychoanalytic theory. Bringing up the id, ego, and superego example from the previous slide, the narrator takes on a great role of being in that similar position, whether it was thinking on the spot, getting anxiety while talking to his crush, or getting interrupted or irritated by his elderly uncle who doesn't have the greatest memory. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you learned more about psychology and how it all started and how to analyze people through their actions.